When I got that text message 3 years ago saying the old elm tree needed to come down, boy was I excited. Even though I'd never used a chainsaw before, I was immediately online looking for a used chainsaw. The bigger the better. Little did I know how much work it was going to be to use an Alaskan mill to mill that bad boy up. Well, it ended up getting done, and this finally is the first project we made from that wood. All the slabs have been drying outdoors for about 3 years now. This piece was the cap piece or the top piece, and I had a project in mind for it since I saw it. I brought this piece inside my house for the last 6 months in an attempt to help it reach equilibrium a little quicker. First task is to flatten this bad boy up, and to do that I'm going to use the router sled. I stabilized the slab on the workbench with some wedges and hot glue, and now I'm going over the entire surface with this 2-inch router bit to flatten it up. Once I've gotten the surface to where I want it, I'm using this piece of plywood as a straight edge to figure out a sort of longitudinal line down the center of the slab. This is going to be a reference that I can use to mark right angle lines off of for our feet as well as for our waterfall edge joint. I found that longitudinal line basically by eye and also sort of by measuring a little bit off one side that seems straight. From that line, I'm using a square to determine where my feet are going to be, and I'm measuring 18 inches up and making a cut right now, which is where the waterfall edge joint is going to be. This is also about the time I'm realizing my tools are not quite right for the job. My small 6.5-inch skill saw will rip through construction lumber if I'm doing some framing, but through this elm it had a bit of a tough time. As well, since I don't have enough depth of cut on that circular saw, I am using a sort of rusty old handsaw that I have very little experience or practice with. It is getting the job done, but it is not ideal. Now I'm taking the smaller piece, which will become my leg, over to the table saw to cut the 45-degree angle on it. The only reason I feel comfortable doing this cut is because I know that the offcut piece is not going to come apart from the leg, so it cannot fall down into the saw blade and get shot back. If you are going to make a cut like this, make sure your workpiece is supported firmly on the sled, make sure your hand is away from the blade, and go slowly. As you can see, since I did not cut all the way through, it was back to the handsaw. Now, there was no chance of me putting the big bench top on the saw, so I'm going back to the circular saw. Since I need full depth of cut, I'm just going to glue this piece of plywood and use it as a straight edge directly to my piece of wood and run the circular saw against it. With the rounded bottom on the sled, I just have no good way to clamp a straight edge or any sort of guide to it. This is also about the time I'm really wishing I had a proper woodworking workbench. A bench with some weight and hold fast and clamping would really make this go a lot easier. You can see I had to use my body weight to try and hold it down while I cleaned this up with my badly sharpened hand tools and my lack of skill. I test fitted the joint, and to be honest, I wasn't really happy. So I did it again. I re-glued the straight edge on about a 16th inch further back and recut the joint. I realize this will cause a slight inconsistency in the waterfall edge grain, but it is what it is. I also found the multi-tool did a better job for me now in this situation to try and get off this extra chunk of wood. Once I broke that off, I cleaned it up and it didn't look too bad, so I moved forward with adding in some dowels for reinforcement. If you've watched any of my other videos, you know I'm using the Jessam doweling jig that I got for Christmas last year. In order to line the two slabs up, I'm referencing that long longitudinal line we drew right at the beginning with the straight edge. I used that marking on the underside of the slabs to line up with the center line of the doweling jig. From there, I drilled as many holes across as would fit. I used a 3/8 of an inch dowel size, and I managed to fit 7 holes across the joint. Other options for reinforcement on this joint would be a domino, or I would use a router with an edge guide referencing the pointed edge of the miter, and I would just run a groove along the entire joint, put in a slip tenon, and call it a day. On the table saw, I cut a piece of plywood at a 45-degree angle, and I'm gluing this directly to my wooden slabs. These are going to be clamping cauls. These will pop right off later, and any glue residue will easily sand off. Now in a sec, I'm going to dry fit the joint, and you're going to see that these clamping cauls are really going to help pull it together, and the outside actually looks really good. However, I knew before even starting this project that due to the uneven thickness of the log and the curvature of the outside of the log, I was going to have to get a little creative with blending in the back side of the joint. You can kind of see what I mean by that here, where the back side of the joint does not line up and it is not flush. We'll take care of that shortly. Also, I just want to let you know that at the end of the video, I'll toss a few pictures of the Alaskan mill and the log and show you what the setup looked like. You can see here the outside of the joint came together really nice. What I'm doing with a pencil is tracing out where the overlap is or where the excess material is on the joint. Then I'm grabbing my grinder with a flap disc and I'm going to get a little creative, get a little artistic, and I'm going to try and blend in to my line and then to the bark and just try and make it flow and work together a little nicer. It's not going to be perfect, but you're not really going to see the joint. I just want it to be better. I'm not usually into rustic furniture, but I'm making a bench out of half a log, so it's kind of hard to avoid. Finally, it's time to cut the legs down to the right height and get ready for the glue up. You can see here, I take those both feet off, and whoa, the joint's glued. I forgot to record, but you can just want to say there was a ton of squeeze out and it went together pretty nicely. Here, I'm popping the cowls off with a chisel. A little bit of sanding is going to take care of that residue. And now it's time to deal with the other leg. My original design called for a steel leg to do sort of a three-legged bench, but it was honestly just too tippy. My backup plan was a trapezoidal shape, either wood or metal, but it just didn't look good. So, you might have guessed it, we're going to waterfall the other edge. It was not part of the original plan, but after a lot of discussion, we just decided that a double waterfall was going to look best. On the plus side, we've already done these cuts once or twice, so this time around they go much smoother. On the negative side, we have to work with a bench that's already partially glued up and a leg sticking down at an angle, which causes some frustration. I guess the takeaway is, don't glue up your project until you absolutely finally have to. You live and learn. You can see here we've already cut the miter on the new leg, and I'm just working on sawing through the miter on the other side of the bench. I also decided this time that I'm going to glue the doweling jig down to the miter joint to keep it in place when I drill the first hole. By using a piece of tape on the back of your jig, you can put super glue on it and glue it to your log, and it's not going to go anywhere. That being said, as I was editing this video, I realized there was a much simpler solution that was staring me right in the face. All I had to do was take a pocket hole screw or a screw with a washer and install it through two of the holes that I wasn't going to drill through. That would have held the jig in place, let me put in the holes that I needed, and then remove them. And those screw holes would be hidden inside a joint and no one would ever see them. Again, sometimes you just learn things by doing them and doing them badly. I also decided on this side of the joint that I was going to try and put 2 rows of dowels. I really don't think that the joint needed it. It honestly felt really strong with one set, but I was curious to see how accurate this doweling jig could be. So I figured let's push our luck, put in 2 rows of dowels, and worst case scenario, if I can't get the joint to close up, we'll only install 1 row of dowels when we do the glue up. As I just wanted to take a second to ask you to subscribe if you're enjoying the content, or if you're enjoying watching me fumble around with a project that I have no business doing. Boy, is anyone else getting a case of deja vu? I feel like I've seen this before. Nope, wait, you haven't seen this. At least this time around you get to see the glue up. The very exciting glue up. Anyway, this glue up went pretty uneventful. There was a little more resistance than I had on the first side, which obviously was due to almost twice as many dowels. But the glue joint on the outside edge ended up looking even better than the first side, believe it or not. I initially used a couple quick clamps to pull the joint together, but realized that I need a little more force to pull the joint tight. I moved on to some F-style clamps, and it really impressed me just how much force I could apply to these glued-on clamping cauls. They held really well, and between the clamps and a bit of a mallet, it pulled the joint tight. I wiped out the excess glue and used a screwdriver to burnish the edge a little bit just to bring that joint together while the glue was wet. Once everything was done, I sanded and cleaned, and now you're in for a treat. I'm about to showcase a technique that YouTube woodworking hasn't seen since 2013. I'm going to spray a film finish. Yes, folks, I'm spraying water-based polyurethane on the bottom of this project, if you can believe it. If you've only been watching YouTube for a few years, you've probably never even seen this happen, but I promise you this used to be all the rage back in the day. I'm spraying the bottom of the project just because it really makes it a lot easier to get into all the nooks and crannies with the irregularities on this log. I did 3 coats, I gave it a light scuff sand in between coats, and once it was dry, it looked fine. What can I say? I'm not really focusing on the bottom of this bench. I just wanted it sealed. Once that was done, I flipped it over, I sanded all the top and sides to 150 grit, and then I took a wet rag and I'm just wiping the entire bench down so that I can pop the grain. I'm doing this right before bed so that when I come back in the morning, everything will be completely dry. Now that it's morning and the sun's in my eyes, I'm giving it a very light sand with 220 grit sandpaper, first on the orbital, and then touching up with hand sanding in any of the edges, always going in the direction of the grain. The idea isn't to bring it to a full 220 grit sanding, it's just to take down the raised portion of the grain. I clean it off with some air, wipe it down with some mineral spirits, let it dry, and then we apply the Rubio. There you go, folks. You didn't think I was going to apply a film finish to the top, did ya? I'm using Rubio in the 5% white color. I really like how the white pigment gets into the grains on this elm, and I like that the final color is very natural looking actually. It looks very original to what the wood looked prior to finish, but with these accents and these pops from the pigment. I just fell in love with this elm on this project, and I'm pumped to use the rest of the elm that I have in other projects. I'm not sure if this video footage is doing it justice, but I really fell in love with the grain of this wood. I have 7 or 8 slabs of it kicking around on the side of my house, so if you have any suggestions on a project, hit me up in the comments. As well, I'm going to toss a couple pictures in the end showing the elm tree before we cut it down and the milling process. I wish I had some video for it, but unfortunately I just wasn't feeling back then. Have a good day.